But I do want to bring in atonement theory a little more closely into the work of trauma care and counseling, and especially through attachment theory. So if you want to think of this as a kind of a closer look at attachment theory and atonement theory, I think there really is a lot to say there. My experience being a foster parent, as well as what I've observed of others doing that, as well as other types of situations in church ministry where we're dealing with people with trauma, is a high degree of relational insecurity and instability. Either people expect that people are going to reject them, and so they, reject themselves or reject the relationship beforehand, or there's a degree of a sensitivity that's unusual, or a difficulty with forgiveness because they don't want to relive a pain. I think that type of trauma, when it's put into a community setting, really then needs to interact with, or we need to think about how that intersects with atonement theology. And the first thing is about atonement theology is what is the problem that we're trying to solve. Now, I'll just be explicit. In penal substitutionary atonement, the problem that we're trying to solve, or that Jesus solves, is the problem of I've done evil actions that I should feel guilty about because God is menacing me. Either he wants to separate himself from me, or he wants to torment me for it, because the obedience that he did not receive the first time, he wants to collect on through my suffering. Now, Jesus interposes himself and satisfies that in penal substitutionary atonement. However, if a ministry runs really heavily on that view, then I think people with trauma are going to suffer for it and are going to be vulnerable to emotional abuse again, or be liable to emotionally abuse other people. And here's why. The portrayal of God in penal substitutionary atonement is that he wants to either distance himself further from you or come really close and inflict pain. So, and depending on how it's phrased and things I understand there's nuances. I also understand there's other aspects of Christian theology or Christian community that can offset that, the weightiness of that. But if fundamentally, if I have trauma and I'm thinking about God in those terms, that becomes a little scary. That also becomes perhaps a reason to anticipate it from that kind of thing from other people if I do wrong. And I think then the work of trauma care and the work of pastoral ministry to some degree starts to butt heads, because in the work of trauma, to the extent that I understand it, trauma care is rebuilding a person's sense of self, like all these boundaries that were broken or violated, or neglect that happened. And a person is in recovery from that and needs to reestablish a healthy sense of boundaries and attachment and connection. I think penal substitutionary atonement plays with those things and does not help to stabilize those senses. And so the reason is because a person under penal substitution, PSA, is always threatened with survival emotions. So the survival emotions are guilt, anxiety, relief, and gratitude, right? And you can kind of coordinate that with the preaching, the emotional arc of preaching. The danger, I think, is that someone who always exists on the emotional level of survival, of always kind of being in the place with survival emotions, doesn't get to cultivate what I would call higher emotions, emotions towards thriving, of love, compassion, discernment, and a whole bunch of other things that people who have been traumatized and are working through that really need to cultivate. That's really important because it establishes what they're willing to fight for, the goodness of a relationship, because they have hope and they can recognize love and so on. So, but always being stuck at survival emotions and cultivating that, when a ministry cultivates that, I think that becomes scary. I think the person with trauma then becomes more likely to wind up with friends or perhaps a romantic attachment that another person who doesn't help to cultivate the higher emotions. Instead, they're kind of trying to fit their life experience into the survival emotions of, well, I guess I did wrong, so maybe this is all I deserve, and I should just be relieved that I'm still alive and that I'm surviving, and I should just be grateful. I think that emotional arc is dangerous. Medical substitution, on the other hand, really cultivates the higher emotions, the desire to be the best possible version of myself, to be compassionate, to be faithful, even, like to be present in a relationship where I feel really frustrated, I may feel really angry, I may feel like bolting or fleeing or whatever, but I'm going to stay, even though that somehow is triggering to me, given that I'm safe. If all that I really need to work on is recognizing, I'm safe here, I can stay, and I can do this, I can work on the patience, I could recognize that this other person or this community is actually being loving and responsive and patient, right? They're not pressuring me, but they are inviting me to respond and to have a faster cycle time of how I can deal with these difficult emotions. I think medical substitutionary atonement works well with that because it's saying Jesus' humanness, Jesus' humanity shows us what it means to be a person, a human being who's under pressure, but look at how he responds and how does that inform our response. So yes, there's all kinds of things going on in me, but I can look to Jesus and I'm participating with him by his Spirit. The other major thing related to atonement that I think is really important in regards to trauma is, do I always have to present, or do I always have to understand Jesus in the mode of, I am the offender? Now, I think with penal substitutionary atonement, you do have to, because you offended God's sense of retributive justice. But in medical substitutionary atonement, you don't have to do that. I mean, you could if you're doing problem-oriented evangelism or problem-oriented discipleship. But you could also present Jesus as the solution to something that you're a victim of. You are a victim of what other people have done, what all our ancestors have done. Adam and Eve especially have corrupted our human nature, and we inherit that problem. It's not your fault. It's something that was done, essentially done to you. Now, at the same time, sure, there are things that we've done to make it worse. But if you just want to stick with this, we inherit a problem, and God wants to rescue us from it. God wants to heal us. That's his nature. He wants to come near, and he calls for our participation. He calls for our willingness and our vision of ourselves to be more and more closely aligned with his vision for ourselves, that we could be the best possible version of ourselves, that we don't have to be stuck in these cycles of traumatic response and being triggered and all these things. That can serve a purpose, but again, it's something we want to take steps to grow out of. And with medical substitution, we can present Jesus as the solution to that and hold out hope And I think that gives us a whole new range of things to talk about, to minister out of, a way of recognizing the complexities of people's emotions and saying, we see that, and every one of those emotions actually has a place. Now, we need to interpret it through the wisdom of Jesus and through Jesus himself. But all of the emotions that we experience have a place now, and I think that's a really healthy paradigm. Finally, to wrap up this subject and really to segue into the next ones, I wanted to say that if you are interested in going deeper in this topic, the intersection of trauma and theology, or counseling and theology, we are working on materials and hopefully a conference for 2021 that is completely devoted to these things. Now, one way to organize how counseling actually works is to think of what aspect of the person, of the counselee that we are trying to engage. And someone described it to me in this way, that there is the behavioral, there's the physical, there's the conscious, and the subconscious parts of the person that counselors often engage. And there may be, of course, combinations to that. But we want to look at, how each of those things intersects with the theology that the early church understood as a medical atonement and an experience of God's restorative justice. So as we look at those things, behavioral, physical, conscious, and subconscious aspects of counseling, stay tuned and stay in touch with us, because we are learning more about this and we're excited to share this.